The chandeliers in Vienna glowed like captured sunlight, spilling gold across velvet curtains and polished marble floors. It was the kind of hall where every whisper seemed to echo through centuries of music history. On that evening in 1962, the audience had gathered for greatness, but not the kind associated with Frank Sinatra. They had come for opera, for voices trained from childhood to fill cathedrals, for music believed to belong to a higher, untouchable world. Sinatra sat quietly near the front rows, impeccably dressed as always, his posture relaxed but attentive. He applauded politely as the celebrated soprano Amelia Kovacs delivered a breathtaking aria that brought the audience to its feet. To the crowd, she represented pure classical artistry, discipline, training, tradition. Sinatra, in contrast, was a celebrity from another universe. Successful, charming, famous on the radio, but in their eyes, merely an entertainer. When the formal concert ended, the hall transformed. Crystal glasses clinked softly, conversations blossomed beneath the chandeliers, and the reception began. Critics clustered together discussing technique, composers debated harmony and structure, singers compared vocal ranges. Beneath the elegant smiles ran an invisible hierarchy, an unspoken belief that classical music stood above everything else. Near a grand piano, Sinatra found himself surrounded by polite smiles and distant admiration. He listened more than he spoke, observing the room with the calm awareness of someone who had experienced both adoration and rejection in equal measure. Then, during a discussion about American music, a famous baritone chuckled and made a remark that hovered somewhere between humor and insult. "Sinatra is a wonderful entertainer," he said lightly, "but classical music is something else entirely. It demands discipline, sacrifice, not microphones and charm." A ripple of laughter floated through the group. It wasn't cruel, but it carried weight. Several heads turned toward Sinatra, waiting to see how the American star would react. Across the room, Amelia Kovacs heard the comment. Still glowing from her performance, she stepped closer with a polite smile that concealed a spark of playful challenge. "Mr. Sinatra," she said gently, her voice clear enough for everyone nearby to hear, "would you care to sing something classical for us?" The room froze. The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was a polite impossibility, a challenge no one expected him to accept. For a moment, Sinatra said nothing. He lifted his glass slowly, took a sip, and looked around the room. Critics watched with amused curiosity. Musicians waited with quiet confidence. Aristocrats leaned in slightly. Finally, Sinatra spoke. "I'm not an opera singer," he said calmly, "but if you don't mind, I'll try." The simplicity of the words shifted the air in the room. A few guests exchanged skeptical smiles. Someone laughed softly, but Sinatra didn't joke or retreat. Instead, he set down his glass and walked toward the grand piano. His steps were slow, measured, almost reflective, as though he were stepping into a memory rather than a performance. The pianist looked up, startled. "Which piece, Mr. Sinatra?" Sinatra paused for a moment, glancing toward the ceiling, where the echoes of countless performances seemed to linger. "Schubert," he said quietly. "Ave Maria. Original key." A wave of whispers swept through the hall. Franz Schubert's Ave Maria was sacred territory, an aria requiring precision, emotional depth, and technical control. Even trained vocalists approached it with caution, and now a man known for nightclub ballads stood ready to attempt it without a microphone, without an orchestra, before Europe's most demanding audience. The pianist placed his hands on the keys. The first notes rose gently into the air. Sinatra closed his eyes. When the first note left his lips, it was so soft that several listeners thought they had imagined it. But within seconds, something began to change. The sound grew, not louder, but deeper, warmer. It filled the hall not with power, but with presence. This was not operatic thunder, it was something else, something human. Sinatra wasn't attacking the music, he was living inside it. The pianist glanced up, surprised. Sinatra's phrasing was unusual, stretching some notes, releasing others early, shaping the melody as though it were a story unfolding rather than a technical exercise. At first, a few critics exchanged knowing glances. Surely this would be interesting, but inadequate. Yet the laughter never came. Instead, the hall grew quieter. Sinatra's voice carried an emotional weight that could not be measured in volume or technique. He wasn't trying to dominate the music. He was conversing with it, gently reshaping each phrase. Listeners leaned forward without realizing it. Curiosity had turned into attention. Attention turned into silence. Amelia Kovacs stood motionless now, her playful smile gone. Something in the performance unsettled her, not because it was flawed, but because it revealed something she had never considered. That artistry did not belong exclusively to technique. When the melody rose into the most delicate section of the piece, several musicians braced themselves. This was where the voice would crack, where the experiment would collapse. But Sinatra approached the notes carefully, almost tenderly. He didn't force them. He allowed them to bloom naturally. His voice lacked the operatic power they were used to, yet it carried something many technically perfect performances did not: truth. A conductor in the audience slowly lowered his head. A young violinist felt her throat tighten. A critic who had prepared clever remarks found himself unable to write a single word. Sinatra continued singing with his eyes closed, unaware of the shift unfolding around him. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He simply sang as if remembering something long buried beneath years of fame and expectation. As the final phrases arrived, the melody softened again, returning to the fragile intimacy where it had begun. The last note lingered, then faded. Silence, no applause, no whispers, just an almost sacred stillness stretching across the hall. Sinatra opened his eyes, gave a small, apologetic smile, and stepped away from the piano. He nodded politely to the pianist and began to walk back through the crowd as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But behind him, everything had changed. After several long seconds, a single pair of hands began to clap. An elderly composer near the front. Slow, respectful. Another joined. Then another. Soon the entire hall was applauding, not wildly, but with a deep, humbled admiration. Amelia Kovacs walked toward Sinatra through the crowd. When she reached him, she hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. Finally, she bowed her head slightly. "Tonight," she said quietly, "I learned something I should have known all along." Sinatra smiled gently. "Music isn't about where you come from," he replied softly. "It's about what you carry inside." From that night forward, the story traveled quietly through the circles of Europe's musical elite, not as a stunt, not as a joke, but as a reminder. A reminder that pride can blind even the greatest artists, and that sometimes a voice known only for popular songs can walk into a hall of legends and reveal something they had forgotten. Because true music does not belong to genres. It belongs to the soul, and whenever someone later laughed at the idea of a crooner attempting classical music, someone in the room would simply say, "You should have been there the night Sinatra sang Schubert," and the conversation would end there. In the weeks that followed, the story of that night traveled quietly through Europe's musical circles. Not through newspapers or loud headlines, but through whispers in rehearsal rooms and conversations after concerts. Musicians who had been present spoke about it with a kind of careful respect, as if describing something fragile that might lose its magic if exaggerated. Some insisted that Frank Sinatra had somehow understood the soul of Franz Schubert's music in a way few trained singers ever managed. Others admitted, sometimes reluctantly, that they had underestimated what artistry truly meant. Meanwhile, Sinatra himself never mentioned the performance publicly. To him, it was simply another night, another song. Yet those who had stood beneath the chandeliers of that Vienna hall could not forget the moment when categories dissolved and pride gave way to humility. Even Amelia Kovacs found herself reflecting on it during her performances. She began listening differently, searching for emotion beyond perfection. Months later, a young student asked her what the most important lesson in music was. She paused for a long moment before answering. "Technique matters," she said gently, "but never forget that the heart must sing first."